So this section will be about naming and inspecting container. So naming will let us reference containers more easily, and inspecting will let us get a lot of information about containers. So naming, so far we have used the ID of the containers when we wanted to reference them, either the full ID or a kind of shorter ID. And we can also use the name. We can name our containers with a unique name, and then we can use that name when we work on the container. By default, all the names that we see are names of inventors with a mood. Like if I do docker ps-a, I have like Brave Kilby, Nifty Knuth, Amazing Williams, etc. So all these names are inventors. So what happens is that if you don't specify a name, then the engine just makes up a name and use it. I mean, it has a list of moods, a list of names, and it puts them together. Except one thing, it will never come up with a container named Boring Wozniak, because Steve Wozniak is never boring, and it's actually, I mean, that's in the code here. If so, yeah, that's maybe my favorite piece of trivia about. So how do we specify our own names? That's super easy. We just do docker run -- name. So for instance, I'm going to run the clock container and name it TikTok. So docker run -- name TikTok jpetazzo/clock. And I have the same old clock as before, like nothing has changed. But since names are unique, if I interrupt that and I try again, it's going to tell me, nope, that name already exists. Because when I interrupt the container, remember, I'm just stopping the container. So it's not using CPU, RAM, etc., but it's still on disk, it still exists. So the name TikTok is still taken. So if I want to be able to run another TikTok container, I have to do docker rm to remove the container TikTok. And now I can start a new one. Now let's imagine, okay, yeah.
So this is a temporary name.
This is a temporary name. What do you mean by temporary?
Well, it's not global, right? I mean, I can run on a different Docker environment, have another TikTok.
Oh, right. It's not a global name in the sense that obviously, like if I have two Docker machines, I can -- name TikTok here, and I can -- name TikTok there. So yeah.
It's not embedded in the image either, correct?
And it's not embedded in the image either, no. The image doesn't contain a default name or anything like that. If I want a global identity for my container names, there are a few ways to achieve that. Well, first of all, it's not going to be universally global, because that would assume that all the Docker machines in the entire world are connected together. But in a cluster, I can ensure unicity. And so there are really two things behind the name. One is I get a reference, and I know, okay, I can reference that container with that name. So when I'm on a cluster, this will typically be achieved with labels, because that will be a better way to do that. And the wait, I might have mixed up the two. So one is unicity, and the other one is having a reference. Having a reference can be achieved with labels, and unicity on a cluster, that one will be a little bit trickier. So depending on the clustering and orchestration system you use, the mechanism will be different. For instance, if we're using Swarm, that we will see tomorrow, in that case we would go through a service. The service would have a name, and the service could have multiple containers, but we will set that number of containers to 1. So it's a little bit indirect, but we can achieve the same thing. Now let's imagine that instead of, oh yeah, sorry.
Is there a way to influence the default naming from the Docker file?
Is there a way to influence the default naming? No. No, these are some very arbitrary design decisions where while the Docker file can specify a lot of things, but there is a kind of arbitrary line of things that it can't really decide. Like for instance, when we will tackle the network stack, we will see that in the Docker file, you can say, this container has a web server listening on port 80. And that's a bit of information that the engine can use. However, you cannot say, I want that port 80 in the container to be exposed on port 80 on the host. That you cannot do. You can say what's inside the container, but you cannot say on what it should be mapped or associated to outside of the container. When you need that, that's where you use tools like Compose, for instance, that let you create that association. The goal is to have images that are really, let's say, universal in the sense that you can run that image anywhere, and the state of the outside world should never have an influence of that on that in a way. Like if you have an image that say, oh, this should be running on port 1234, then if you already have something running on port 1234, the image won't be able to run. So that's why there is a kind of arbitrary like line that says in the image it has to be perfectly independent of outside, and then when you need to do like plumbing, etc., then it will be with the outside tools. That makes sense? Okay. So imagine for a moment that this is an actual production application and I have a problem with it, and so I have to stop it and I have to put another one to replace it. So I have stopped my TikTok container and I want to put another one immediately, but my TikTok name is already taken. So I have to do docker rm TikTok, but if I do that, I get rid of my container and I can't investigate what's going on. So that's why there is the rename operation. The rename operation is not here so that if you don't like Happy Tesla, you can replace it with Boring Euclid or whatever. The rename operation is here so that you can say, okay, I can do docker rename TikTok, find that bug, and then I can docker run TikTok, run docker run TikTok immediately. Now, so I have replaced my TikTok container or my production database or whatever, and my old version, the one that I had to stop or the one that crashed or whatever, now it's set aside. It's called find that bug now, and now I can take my time to investigate it. So that's why there is a rename command.